Welcome. Thank you for tuning in today to Supported Decision Making with Jeanie, Rowe, and Mary Shehan. We are so appreciative that Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council can partner with Michigan Alliance for Families to bring you this fantastic information. So we want to thank them for joining us today. If you have additional questions after viewing this webinar, if you have additional questions in the future, remember that Michigan Alliance for Families is your guide to all things special education. We're your totally free guide to all things special education. So, as you are trying to navigate or get more information, better understand, possibly helping your child or young adult grow into a um, self-determined adult and thinking about supported decision making, please feel free to reach out to your regional parent mentors for more information. They live across the state where they serve, so they're connected to their local communities. They are available to help you find information, resources, and to answer your questions. So please do not hesitate to reach out to our regional parent mentors. And with that, I would love to introduce Jeanie and Mary. You guys want to take it away?
Hi, my name is Jeanie Rowe. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a Civic Center for Youth Voice, Youth Choice, Youth Ambassador. I am also a 21-year-old with an intellectual developmental disability. I am here with Mary Shehan, and I'm also living the young adult life.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Shehan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Community Inclusion Coordinator for the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm also the Council's lead staff on its Supported Decision-Making Initiative. My background is as a psychologist, but I'm also a family member of several people with disabilities. So much of my work comes from being the role of a niece or that of the bratty little sister. Next slide, please.
Outcomes of today. What's the purpose of this presentation? We're going to give you some outcomes. A brief explanation of the difference between SDM, supported decision making, and guardianship. More of a depth look at tools that addresses decision making concerns. See real life examples of how to use these tools for each young adult once. See where this information goes in an IEP. Next slide. Tash Connection 2017. We all make decisions, big or small, every day. We may take for granted that we have those rights to exercise such autonomy over our lives. That we often have a network of trusted friends and allies with whom we consult to make important decisions that affect our lives. Next slide. Tash is a leading disability advocacy organization, and all major advocacy organizations within the state is represented within the coalition. Next slide. Supported decision-making should be considered before guardianship, and the supported decision-making process should be incorporated as a part of the guardianship if guardianship is necessary. Next slide.
So, what does the law say about guardianship? It says that it shall be utilized only as is necessary to promote and protect the well-being of the individual, and shall be designed to encourage the development of maximum self-reliance and autonomy. I mean, many people, when they come to a presentation, think the presenters made this stuff up. This is fact. It's in Michigan Compiled Law, Chapter 6, as the slide says. And this is, as what it says in the Mental Health Code, it's critical for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to understand the law that governs guardianship for their population. And it's important that family members, loved ones, also understand what the law actually says. Many people report to us that, who are under guardianship, that this is not really how it works. Oftentimes, guardians act as the sole decision maker for a ward, and they're not really focused on the person growing and changing and building skills over time. So it's really important. This last piece should be designed to encourage the development and maximum self-reliance and autonomy with the individual. And again, as Jeanie pointed out in the last slide, supported decision-making can be used within a guardianship process if a guardian's already been appointed. Next slide, please.
My experience with guardianship. My first experience of thinking about guardianship was when I was about to turn 18, and it was mentioned at my IEP. I had never spoken to my family about this before. That it made me really think about how I would make decisions about my life as an adult. Then I saw a presentation and told my teacher I wanted to be involved in advocacy. She put me in touch with Mary, and the rest of my advocacy journey is history. The folks at DD Council gave me lots of ideas how I could get involved with the advocacy movement. As I began advocating for myself, I wanted in my young adult life, I also became an advocate for others and became a civic supported decision-making youth ambassador. We'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Next slide.
So as we look at this slide, it's important for people to understand how the process is supposed to happen for guardianship. This flow chart indicates that a petition can be filed. It's filed with probate court in any county in Michigan. And again, there are two laws that govern guardianship. One is EPIC, or Estates Planning of Protected Individuals Code. And so in probate court, there'll be a petition for an allegedly incapacitated person, and that's when it's filed under that law. The other law, as we said earlier, touched upon earlier, is the Mental Health Code. And that's the law that governs guardianship for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So there's a separate petition on most probate courts' websites for a person with an alleged developmental disability. So then that petition is adjoined or attached with an evaluation report done by a psychologist or a psychiatrist and a physical health statement. The judge evaluates those, you see at the right, and they can determine they're either going to schedule a hearing to hear more details or grant a temporary guardianship. That's often used in a medical situation when medical personnel feel an individual needs to have surgery or a major medical procedure and feel that the person can't give informed consent. So that's a decision that the judge makes. Or, as you see moving down from that top box at the left, a date of a hearing will be scheduled. Once that's determined, then there's a notice of the hearing, and it's distributed to the alleged ward and other parties. And that language is really important, alleged ward, because a lot of people don't realize in guardianship, a person becomes a ward of the state. Similar to what you might be more familiar with, a young child who where parental rights have been removed or terminated for whatever reason becomes a ward of the state. A person under guardianship is the same, a ward of the state. What's difficult here is that for many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, particularly if they're living in a congregate facility like a group home, might not get mail real regularly and might not get mail on time. So they may not even be aware that a guardian petition has been filed. And we know many situations where people weren't able to be in court and to testify or bring witnesses. And so it's important to understand how this process is supposed to happen. The court will identify next of kin and theoretically, send the petition and notice of the hearing to that person, but they may not know all the significant other people in this individual's life. They may not know who's in their circle of support. So those people who, again, could support and help them through this process might not be aware that a petition's been filed. And then moving down in the flow chart, you see an appointment of attorney for the alleged ward. If the individual is aware of the hearing, they can hire an attorney to represent them in court. If not, or they are unable to afford one will be appointed by the court. And that individual is supposed to help them to determine how best to lay out a case for not having a guardianship and really uphold their rights. Then the hearing happens. Unfortunately, for many people with IDD, they don't meet their guardian ad litem or their attorney till just before they enter the court system. They're often in the hallway waiting for the hearing to happen, and that's when they first meet their attorney. So this person hasn't had a true sense of really advocating for, understanding the history, the dynamics of the person's life, or what their hopes and dreams are for their future. So then the hearing happens in court. I've been to many guardianship hearings that have lasted 15 minutes or less in the courtroom. So there's not often, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, a strong, substantial case that's built. The judge then decides either that the petition's dismissed. In that case, it would mean that the judge is saying a guardianship is not necessary for this individual. Or they can grant a full plenary guardianship or a partial or limited guardianship. And we'll explain those terms a little bit more in a moment here. In either case, if a guardianship is granted, then an annual report is due by the guardian. And that report goes through the medical issues that have happened over the last year with the individual. It goes through financial resources of the individual and what they've been spent on. And so many families who petition to be guardian don't understand or don't recognize that they are supposed to be filling out an annual report. If the report is not due to the court by the time frame that they're given, there are times when a family member becomes a guardian, and then because reports are late, a judge can determine that they're going to remove that guardian and change it to a public guardian who may or may not know much about that individual. So that's an important thing for family members to know. This is all, again, a Michigan compiled law. You see the citation there at the bottom left of the screen. So again, it's really important to understand how it's supposed to flow. Many times for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that doesn't really happen. Jeanie, do you have anything you want to say about that?
Sure. It doesn't flow that way, but that is why we do this, to make sure that people know the limits of the guardian and what does happen to their loved one. Next slide.
Absolutely. What you were just saying is really critical. It's important to know what the process is and to know how you can best support your loved one or yourself in these situations. So we mentioned a few terms earlier in the last slide. One was guardianship of the person or guardianship of the estate. So there's kind of two different things. We talk about guardianship in the last slide, but guardianship of the person means that the guardian has been given legal decision-making power over programming for that individual, maybe educational programming, maybe programming through a community mental health. And that decision-making power is given to another individual by the judge. Guardianship of the estate just means that that individual also has decision-making power over the individual's property and their money. Now, this third bullet down, conservatorship, really is a term that's used primarily in EPIC, Estates Planning and Protected Individual Code, as we mentioned. And that means that the individual, it's similar to guardianship of the estate. It means the individual has decision-making power over the property and finances of an individual. At the bottom of the screen, you see the scope of guardianship. We mentioned these terms in the flow chart earlier. Full or plenary guardianship means that the judge has granted that this substitute decision maker has now legal obligations and legal control over decisions that have to do with almost every life domain for the individual. The judge could decide a partial or limited guardianship. Those terms are used kind of interchangeably. And in this situation, the judge will write specifically what decision-making powers the guardian has and which ones are retained by the individual. And really, this last bullet point is to talk about the fact that a judge can determine this however they want. It could be a combination, like a judge could grant that an individual has total decision-making power over the finances or conservatorship, but only partial or limited control over programming or housing or day-to-day activities of the individual. So it can vary greatly from court to court, and it can vary greatly from judge to judge. One thing to remember, if a partial or limited guardianship is granted, that it expires every 5 years, and at which time that needs to be reevaluated by the judge. So the case would come back before court, and everyone has an opportunity to restate whether they feel the guardianship should continue or whether it should be terminated or changed or altered in some way. Next slide, please.
How do you feel when one of your rights are in jeopardy? The rights that are in jeopardy under guardianship are deciding where you want to live, consulting or preventing a medical or core decision or treatment for yourself, deciding where to travel and how to travel, how you spend your money, making changes in educational or vocational programs, determining if and whom can you date, what personal property you can own, if and where you can worship. It is important that we, as people with disabilities, family members, and professionals, understand the limits that are placed on people with disability under guardianship. Let's discuss for a moment this idea. Choose one of the rights that you would be willing to give up for autonomy. Next slide.
So let's just pause for a moment. We're going to ask Renee if you would pop in and just tell us, if you had to give up one of those rights on the screen, what right would it be?
I find that an offensive question. I don't want to give up any of my rights.
Yeah. When we do this and we have a large audience, we ask that question. We actually pause sometimes when we have time in a longer presentation. We go to breakout rooms and have people discuss this. And people have that same reaction, like, what do you mean? Like, wait, what do you mean? I'm not picking any of these, because nobody wants to feel like they're giving up a right. Nobody wants somebody else to decide where they live or what medical treatment they can and can't have, or how to travel, or who to date, or where or how to worship. So this is we really want people to focus when they come to these presentations on this could be you. Someday, for all of us, this could be us. The largest reason or way people end up under guardianship is as we age. And we hope we all age, because the alternative's not that great to think about. So think about if somebody else in your life were going to make that decision and who you would want it to be. Would you want it to be somebody you've never met before, that doesn't know your hopes and dreams for the future, doesn't know the dynamics of your family or relationships with your community around you? This is a really tough thing, isn't it, Jeanie?
Yes, because
go ahead.
Because as a person with an intellectual developmental disability, it just makes me very upset that somebody would take these rights away from somebody that is they just need a little bit of help, but they're not willing to put in the time or effort to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to talk more about that very point, Jeanie. We're going to talk more about tools you can use when people need support in different areas. Thanks, Renee, for answering that question. Okay, if we want to go on to the next slide, please. So we've been talking about the guardianship piece of this because you need to kind of know the history before you can think about supported decision-making. So people, it's a new phrase. A lot of people haven't heard that word or that collection of words together used together before. So let's talk about what it is. We all need supporters and helpers and consultants in our lives in order to make good decisions, whether we have a disability or not. So really, in a nutshell, what supported decision-making is naturalizing or normalizing or making typical the same way every adult makes decisions in their life, and creating opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to do those same things, to create around themselves relationships and social capital built on those relationships, and people they know and trust become their supporters. And then those individuals help them make decisions in different areas of their life. And when you think about this, it's not that different for every other adult. I don't know that much about cars. So when I need to have work done on my car, I have my people that I go to. I have people that I know that I trust will give me good advice. I know before I go into taking my car to a mechanic, what's wrong with it, about how much it should cost. And I get that information from my son, my brother-in-law who works on vehicles and knows a lot about cars. And so that way I have these circle of support, these helpers, these supporters who help me make the wisest decision about spending money when it comes time to fixing my car. We all have those people in our lives. We don't often call them this, but they're our circle of support. And that's really no different for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. So again, kind of in a nutshell, what's the difference between guardianship and supported decision-making? A guardian is a substituted decision maker. It ultimately means you no longer make decisions about that aspect of your life. The guardian makes those decisions, and that puts limits on your rights, your choices, and your freedom. Even in a situation where you have a guardian who you know and knows about you, it really is giving that legal right to make decisions about whatever aspect is written into the guardianship papers over to another person. Whereas supported decision-making is a process that enables people with disabilities to retain and exercise their own rights and make and communicate choices in regard to personal and legal matters. It's just so critical that we understand this piece, that it's actually rights being removed in a guardianship. Next slide, please. So here on the slide, you see people from Michigan. And it's important to understand that supported decision-making can be used by everyone. Sometimes we have people come to presentations who feel like, well, supported decision-making could be used by a person who speaks and can communicate, and they use phrases like that. Well, in my mind, everyone communicates. We just need to get really good about understanding. We need to listen to people with our whole self. Watch behavior, watch how close or how far, proxemics and kinesics, that they get to another individual or to an activity. We can tell by facial expressions or communication boards or through interpreters. So supported decision-making really can be used by all people. You see on the screen, doesn't matter whether you're 15 years old and living in a urban area or a 60-some-year-old person living in a rural area. Doesn't matter whether you're Hispanic, Caucasian, Black, identify as male or female, as non-binary, doesn't matter. Supported decision-making can be used by all people. Next slide, please. In this slide, we really talk about supported decision-making isn't as complicated as a lot of people tend to think it is. It really starts with starting the conversation. In a few slides from now, we're going to share some tools you can use to start that conversation with individuals. And then it's identifying who is willing and able to assist or be part of that person's circle of support. Sometimes it's identifying people or gaps, people that aren't there now, but that you could help that individual develop relationships with. Or it could be helping them develop a relationship with a particular organization who can, again, be part of their circle of support. Step 3 is really planning and communicating, really kind of having those conversations, maybe coming together for a meeting. It could be a meeting prior to an IEP, or it could be a meeting prior to a person-centered plan, where you're planning and communicate where there is where you need support and who's going to provide that support to you. Step 4 is setting up the agreement, making sure the individual themselves is agreeing that this is the person I want to help me make decisions in this area. And the person who's going to be the supporter agreeing that they're going to put the time and effort in and do the tasks that are requested of the individual. So it's a two-way street. So it's setting up that agreement. That agreement can be set up as a formal written document, notarized and worked on with a lawyer, or it could be an informal verbal kind of agreement between people. It just depends on what works for that individual. And we always say be person-centered. Step 5 is letting everyone know. It's important that if the focus person is involved with lots of different organizations, that all those organizations know the information. It's important in a medical situation for the hospitals in the area to have the information of who helps support this individual with medical decisions. Maybe it's a patient advocate or a medical proxy. All of those kind of things are important to communicate and get on everyone's record. Next slide, please. So here we see some supported decision-making tools. These are from a selection of tools called Life Course or Charting the Life Course tools. This is a trajectory. This is one that the individual shown, Kevin, did with family and friends and people in a circle of support during COVID. Really, you see him wearing the mask there. An example of one of the things that his supporters helped him figure out was doctors for years had been talking about him losing weight and maybe making too many decisions for him because it was very difficult for him to do that over the years. But once he had the ability to have supporters to say, how would that work for you? What do you want to do to lose weight? What do you want to do to get healthy and get in shape? He could make his own decisions. During COVID, one of the things he really wanted to do was get out of the house. Like many of us during the period of time that Michigan was locked down, that was really important to him. So helping him to develop safe ways to continue to walk. You see that he's outside, he was wearing a mask, and he was able to walk on trails. And that became a critical part of him losing weight and getting healthy. So again, when you look at where a person's come from, their past life experience, and then in the column in the middle, where they want to head, that dream of what you want life to be in a time frame, and also what you want to have in your life and what you don't at the far right. So these tools are one thing that you can do to start that conversation with people about supported decision making versus a guardianship situation. Next slide, please. This is Amy. And there are a couple tools here, again, from Life Course tools. The first is exploring decision-making supports. And there's really kind of 3 columns. And it's a multi-page tool. You're just seeing the front page here as a graphic. It goes through the life domains like daily life and employment or healthy living, and then ask specific questions. And the individual in their circle can check the boxes at the right, determine whether this is a decision that the individual makes on their own, whether they need some support, or whether they need somebody to make that decision for them. And these are living, breathing documents. So you see the document, you see on the right where Amy's filled that out. Now, this was a year or 2 ago, And her document looks different now. Those X's that you see in the green area on the far right column have really moved to the blue column. Amy's an individual that started out being an autonomous decision-making adult. As family members passed away and she was more as a family on her own, people felt she needed to have a guardian. She ended up under a full plenary guardian and conservator. So somebody handled her daily decisions, somebody handled her finances. Amy was able to be a strong advocate and work with her circle of supporters. And now, as of last year, she no longer has a conservator or guardian. So all those X's have moved from the green to the purple to the blue. And again, this is a nice way to start the conversation and really think about just those areas where a person needs support so that a sweeping decision that governs all aspects of their lives is not made. Those supports are put in place with supported decision-making just in those areas where they need it. So she was able first to convince the judge that she didn't need a guardian to communicate and make decisions about her life, that when she had her circle of support there to help her understand decisions she was being asked to make, she could clearly communicate her choices. And then she was also able to convince the judge a year later that she could handle her own finances as well. Now, it's key to think about the fact that it doesn't mean that Amy gets no support with her finances. She meets once a month with her local ARC, and representatives there sit down with her and go through her finances. She's used a lot of tools that we're going to talk a little bit more about later on in the presentation to help her with her finances, automatic bill paying and relationships with the bank. And all of those kind of things can be put in place so that guardianship or conservatorship is not needed. Next slide, please. Here's another tool from Life Course Toolkit. This is the Integrated Support Star. And again, this is Jake. He's somebody from West Michigan, and he uses the supported decision-making star to help him make decisions about his life. And the star really helps the individual in their circle focus on what strengths and skills and assets a person already has at the top in the light blue section. And then going clockwise to the purple section, who does this person have relationships with in their lives, or who do we need to help this person create relationships in their lives that could help solve whatever the concern or issue is? Then again, going clockwise down into the green section, adding in who are those eligibility specific supports that are available. That could be a person or that could be an organization. And listing all of those out, those people or organizations that could help resolve whatever the concern is. And then in the blue section, also thinking about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as a member of their community, and where in that community could a person get that level of support. Sometimes we focus too much with people with IDD just on eligibility specific services, and we forget about them being integrated members of their community. So where would anybody else in that community get support in a particular area? And that's what we need to look at as well. And then moving up into the pink section, you see assistive technology. Jeanie mentioned that earlier too. There's so much assistive technology out there that can help a person to be safe, maybe living in their own apartment. Things like medication dispensing devices or devices in the kitchen that can help, remind them to turn off the stove when they're cooking. All of those kind of things are thought about in that first, step of supported decision-making, really having that conversation, where they're at, where they need supports, and how those first conversations about how those supports might be given in a way other than guardianship or before guardianship's even thought of. Next slide, please. There are 7 main reasons that people give for why they think a person might need a guardianship. Their education, safety, medical decisions, finances, communication, sexuality, and legal. And there are supports and resources to help an individual in all of these areas. Powers of attorney can be used for financial decisions or decisions regarding, legal contracts like a lease. And a power of attorney is somebody an individual's chosen to help support them in that particular area and can make some decisions on behalf of that person and represent that person. If it's education, it could be something as simple as just signing a release of information form saying, I want my parents and my guardian or my grandparents or my neighbor or a sibling to have access to my educational record and to be invited to all of my IEPs. So again, there are supports and resources far less restrictive and intrusive than guardianship to address any of these concerns. If it's regarding relationships, we really have to think, are we holding people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to a higher standard? Have we made bad relationship decisions at any point in our lives? Well, that's going to happen too for people with intellectual and developmental disability. So again, when we look at these 7 reasons, we really need to think about people with IDD as people first, and they're going to make decisions the same way other adults do. Sometimes those will be really great decisions, and sometimes there'll be people in our lives that think we've made a bad decision in a certain area of our life. And then I want to touch just for a moment before we go on to communication. All people communicate. And again, getting back to what I said earlier, it's really important that we understand our role is making sure we understand what a person's trying to communicate, whether that's through behavior or through gestures or through interpreters or through some other means. It's important that we listen to, with our whole selves, what people are telling us they want and don't want in their lives. Next slide, please. So like all people, it's likely that young people with disabilities will at some point want to emancipate themselves or move away from their parents. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities are learning to weigh options and make choices that lead them to the adult life of their choosing, the life that they want. And like all young adults, youth with disabilities need time to take on more successively important responsibilities. So again, unfortunately, for many people with IDD, all of that learning, all of that growing, all of that discovery really doesn't happen or really wasn't encouraged at a younger age. And so they get to this point where they're 16, 17 years of age and trying to plan for a lifetime of adulthood. And what we want to do with supported decision making is really get families and youth to think about this early on, to give themselves time to bring in who they need to their circle of support, resources, and people that really help them to have a seamless transition from their school years to their adult life. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of those tools. As I mentioned with education, it could be something as simple as signing a release of information form. All ISDs have them. You just need to ask about it. So when the IEP forms and meeting schedules start to talk about decision-making and the transfer of rights, we want families to have already heard about this and already planned for how that student's going to make decisions in their adult life. And so signing release of information form can help that student identify who they want to have in their circle of support, who they want to have access to their educational record, and who they want invited to their IEP meetings. Next slide, please. So it's important that you know that this is part of the law as well. When we talk about transition services, it says beginning no later than the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16 or younger, could be younger if determined, appropriate by the IEP team, and updated annually thereafter. The IEP must include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments related to training, education, employment, and where appropriate, independent living. So these things are supposed to be talked about and planned for early on so that we're not waiting till a student turns 17 and a half and then thinking about, okay, in 6 months or less, what supports we need to have available. Number 2, the transition service, including course of study, needed to assist the child in reaching their goals. So again, things around supported decision-making and how the student's going to make decisions as an adult should be part of the IEP planning and be in the IEP actual form after the meeting. Next slide, please. It also talks about clear and meaningful connections must be established between what the student is learning in high school and what he or she will be doing after leaving high school. So as we mentioned in earlier slides, that trajectory of what the individual wants in their adult life, that's critical to be thinking about early on. And then post-secondary goals are the outcomes based on what that individual wants. They're age appropriate and they're measurable. So again, looking at someone's trajectory that they've created early on about what they want their adult life to look like and having goals on the IEP that lead them to that life. Bullet point 2 is align the goals with the adult outcomes and the post-secondary goals. So again, those goals on the individualized education plan need to be based on what that person wants after they leave school. Transition services are activities. They assist the student in reaching those goals. So the plan is really to help them have that seamless transition to the life they want. Next slide, please. So when we think about that life trajectory and exploring it, when we talked about the life course tools, we showed an example. What's your vision of the life you want? It's really asking those basic questions. And what do you not want? It's important to look at both. You can reach these tools at lifecoursetools.com. They have a whole library of tools that can be used for different aspects. They have a specific section on supported decision-making to really help people start to think about this concept early on. And then sharing this information about your trajectory, your hopes and dreams for your future, what you want your adult life to look like with your whole IEP team. Think about if goals or activities take you to the life you want or the life you don't want. And so that can really open up conversations at IEP meetings. Next slide, please. The trajectory planning tool that we've showed you really highlights your past life that are leading or moving you away from your vision and then provide space for current goals. So again, looking at where you came from and where you want to head is critical. So when the main concern are safety decisions, we need to, again, think about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the all as people within a community. Like all people, it's likely that young people with disabilities will at some point take risks. There's a certain dignity that comes with that opportunity to take risk. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities are learning to weigh options about levels of risk that they want to take. And like all adults, youth with disabilities need to experience low risks with family that is still there around them to support and help them. And it could be family. And when we talk about that word, I want to make it clear that we're talking about chosen family. It may be parents. If the parents aren't involved, it may be other people, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or people from their community. And so we want to make it clear that life for young adults with IDD doesn't have to look that different than life for young adults. Next slide, please. Assistive technology is another piece that we can really pull into supported decision-making and use as a tool. AT can make decisions easier and help people live more independently in their community. Some examples, as I touched on earlier, medication management devices, GPS technology, virtual assistants like Alexa, remote monitoring and control of environments for somebody who's learning to live on their own for the first time. It's important that we integrate the nuts and bolts of IEP integration from an AT perspective, starting with scenarios and tied information to the person throughout the presentation. So again, really thinking at every IEP meeting and in every IEP form, what assistive technology is going to help this young adult live more interdependently the way they want, reaching the adult life they have as a dream. Technology can be a tool to address concerns. Let's give some concrete examples of that. Jeanie, what are some of the assistive technology things that you use on a daily basis to help you have the life that you want now as an adult who's left school?
Sure, Mary. I use my Google Calendar on my laptop to know when I'm doing presentations, either with the DD or I have other appointments coming up or stuff like that. I also have my watch, my smartwatch that is connected to my phone. So if I ever have to get in touch with my mom or I fall out of my chair, it sends my family an SOS that I'm hurt or I need immediate help. So they set that up at my provider and I still keep it that way. Just to give them peace of mind and also to give me the independence. All I gotta do is say, hey Google, or whatever device I'm using, and say what I want, like how to spell this word, call mom or call dad or whoever I want, and I can do those things.
Awesome. So there's so many devices, and just as we kind of touched on a little earlier, many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are kind of frozen in time. Just because a person needs one level of support now doesn't mean that they're always going to need that same level of support. We're all going to grow and change and learn throughout our lifetime, and sometimes new supports or new assistive technology or new services become available. And so once those are added into that person's life, they maybe don't need the same level of support that they needed before. So assistive technology is important to look at. And it's important that it's included in every IEP. Next slide, please. If the main concern are medical decisions, like all people, it is likely that young people with disabilities are going to experience a need for medical care at some point or another in their life. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities should learn to seek accurate information and be able to weigh options. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities need time to take on successively more responsibilities, and when needed, have support to make these decisions. I have this happen often with my brother, where we're going to medical appointments and people are using vocabulary that he may or may not understand. And it's important that we communicate, we in a circle of support, help him communicate to medical personnel how he understands things. Maybe it's with pictures or gestures or graphics to help him understand what decisions he's being asked to make. Once they communicate in his primary language, then he can make those and communicate those decisions on his own. So again, for each person, it's different and you need to be person-centered. Next slide, please. One thing that you can do that's less intrusive or restrictive, if you're helping medical personnel to understand how the individual or the patient communicates, an individual can choose a particular person they want to help them from their circle of support to make those medical decisions. That could be formalized into a medical power of attorney. It's a legal document in which you can appoint an agent to make healthcare decisions on your behalf when you cannot make them for yourselves. And those are legally recognized documents. Sometimes they're called different things. Next slide, please. Sometimes that type of document can be called a patient advocate. A patient advocate is the name given to a healthcare power of attorney in Michigan. Other names include healthcare power of attorney, healthcare proxy, and durable power of attorney for healthcare. All of those are legally recognized documents in the state of Michigan. But yet, someone who is in one of those roles as a patient advocate doesn't have legal authority to make decisions on behalf of the person in other areas of their life. It's just over medical issues. And again, the difference is it's somebody that the person themselves have chosen because it's somebody they know and trust will make the decisions they would want. Next slide, please. In the medical realm, as we think of people with IDD aging, as we all do, we can also think of advance directive. A Michigan advance directive is a document that lets a person select their end-of-life treatment options in the chance they cannot speak for themselves at that period of time. This includes an agent that can be nominated to make healthcare decision on the person's behalf, in addition to treatment options and organ donation selections. So again, that can all be done by a legally recognized document called an advance directive. Again, unlike guardianship, it's a person, the focus person gets to choose who that is based on who they trust and who they think will make the decisions they would want to have happen. Next slide, please. Jeanie, do you want to go through this one?
Sure. When the main concern is financial decisions, like all people, it is likely young people with disabilities will contemplate having income either through public benefits or employment. This could be a worry for a lot of people because they don't know what's available. And there are many organizations that can help you with this. So just reach out to your circle of support to get those things. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities should seek equitable information, weigh the options, and make decisions about their money. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities need time to learn and, when needed, have support to make those decisions. Next slide, please.
That's so important what you were just talking about, Jeanie, because there's so many different tools that can be used to help support individuals with finances that are much less restrictive than a guardianship is, that only address the issue that is of concern, finances, and not other aspects of an individual's life. Things like joint bank accounts, bill paying services, automatic bill payment withdrawals, and fiscal intermediaries can all be put into place to help support financial decisions and support financial transactions that somebody may struggle with. But again, it's not having that same person from their circle of support imposing decisions and other aspects of the focus person's life that they haven't chosen or that they don't need support on. Next slide, please.
Payees are a person through an agency or an organization in situations that Social Security Association selects to manage your benefits with when it determines that you are unable to do it yourself or direct others to do it for you. Unusually, most financial transactions on behalf of Social Security or SSDI beneficiary, they can be comprehensive for the services, usually no more than $42 a month for the beneficiaries on SSDI or SSI income. Plenty of people have a family member or friend as their payee and do not pay them for their help to do this for them. Next slide.
So again, as Jeanie was just saying, there are lots of tools that can be used. And a representative payee is one of those. It could be a person that you choose because you know and trust them. And oftentimes when it is a family member, they don't charge even the $42 a month for that. That can be charged by a public representative payee. Another big concern when it comes to finances for many families is this issue of saving money. And people worry, maybe they limit a person's opportunities to get employed because they have this fear that if they're employed, they're going to lose their public benefits. And so it's important to know that there's resources in this area as well. My ABLE accounts are one opportunity to save money, set money aside for bigger options or bigger things that a person needs, like maybe paying for college or maybe purchasing a vehicle. So people worry that if they have more than that $2,000 in the bank in allowable assets, then they're going to lose their benefits. Sometimes it's a family member who passes away and leaves money for an individual with IDD in their will. And then people worry about how to spend that money quickly or that they'll lose their benefits and have to reapply. There's a couple things that can be done. We mentioned my ABLE accounts. There's also special needs trusts, and those needs can be individual or pooled trusts, where money can then be, put in options where, additional interest can be earned or dividends can be earned. So these types of trust and savings accounts are not counted as assets when they're figuring out benefits. So it's important to get to know factual information about these things. Next slide, please. When the main concern is their ability to communicate, like all people, young people with disabilities will communicate, though that may be in different ways than their neurotypical peers. Like all young adults, youth with disabilities should learn to communicate with others. That should be a primary focus from very early on. So when somebody's a toddler, we want to find out what their yes response is, what their no response is, and start to begin to have them dream for their future and what they want. We do this with neurotypical children all the time. What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? We ask those kind of questions. We need to be asking those questions early on throughout the school years for every person with intellectual and developmental disabilities, so we can start planning early on for the supports they need to achieve that goal. Families need to assure that everyone involved in their loved one's life understand their communication style. This is so critical. As I mentioned earlier, everybody communicates. It's up to us to figure out what that person is communicating and how they're communicating it. Next slide, please. So there are many ways and many types of communication. There are many different ways that we can share what we want and what we don't want with another person. For example, you might use verbal communication when sharing a presentation with a group, or you might use written communication when applying for a job or sending an email. So when we think about communication early on for people with intellectual and developmental disability, it's really important that we help them to identify a way, whether it's through interpreters, through communication, electronic communication devices, whether it's through behavior, or particular gestures, to be able to give a yes and no response so we can understand what they do and don't want in their lives. And that kind of skill, that kind of information should be written into everyone's IEP. So all the people working with them know and can be part of helping them plan that trajectory for their adult life after school. Next slide, please. When the main concern is sexuality, and this is one that often comes up for why a person needs a guardian, well, they'll make bad relationship decisions or they'll be vulnerable. We all are vulnerable whenever we think about having any type of relationship with another human being. It's important to remember that people with IDD, like all people, are sexual human beings. It's even more important for youth with disabilities to learn about sexuality because they're abused at a much higher rate. So rather than not give them information and not have these conversations, it's even more important that we do have these conversations. There are many resources available to support families in explaining complex ideas like consent to youth with disabilities. We have a high number of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have ended up in the court system because they didn't understand concepts regarding sexuality. And again, helping people achieve that adult life that they want is so critical. So again, if that's a concern, know the following. Next slide, please. That we're all human beings, so we're all sexual human beings. Any living, breathing person is going to be a sexual human being. And so we need to be able to address and have those conversations at an early age, all the way through adulthood. When you look at something like Maslow's hierarchy, you see that sexuality kind of permeates, or it's part of every aspect of our lives. Physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. You see those words we circled there? All of those are part of human sexuality, and they appear in every level of Maslow's hierarchy. Next slide. It's important to understand that there are some alarming statistics. And so again, to kind of take the ostrich approach and bury our head in the sand and say people with disabilities and youth with disabilities don't need to know about sexuality, understand how critical it is. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are sexually assaulted at a rate 7 times higher than people without. These statistics came from the Department of Justice as cited by the National Public Radio Report. If you ever have an opportunity, we encourage you to go back to the NPR report called The Hidden Epidemic. And it's important to understand how critical circles of support can be in helping people with IDD who have experienced abuse to be able to report, to be able to identify those differences between healthy and unhealthy relationships. Unfortunately, the statistics are not that good. They're also not that good from a positive perspective if you go on to the next slide. Unfortunately, many people with IDD struggle to achieve the goal of having a healthy relationship. Being in a loving relationship is something that enriches many of our lives. However, research shows that only 3% of people with a learning disability live as a couple, as compared to their same age peers, neurotypical peers. That's 70% of the general population. 70% versus 3%. What does that say about how we help in American society people with IDD to learn and to establish relationships that are healthy versus only experiencing the unhealthy side of relationships? There are a lot of things that can be done. If you turn to the next slide, please. DD Council does have an initiative to help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities understand sexuality. We use the Elevatus training products. We do twice a year teach people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to serve on teams alongside parents and professionals that teach the curriculum, and we do train additional teams every year. This could be something that could be talked about in an IEP meeting. If an individual is interested in learning more, we can help you to find a place where education can be provided in a way that makes sense. We also have on many of our teams trained counselors who can provide both the education and counseling and support when needed. Next slide, please. It's important that we understand that education can't just be minimal. It can't be based on the myths and stereotypes that people with IDD are childlike, so they don't really need to know a lot about sexuality. They only need to know stranger danger. Well, statistically, those people that we talked about who have experienced abuse, it's more likely for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities when abused to be abused by somebody who knows them well, and also somebody who's connected to them because of their disability. So when we think about it from that perspective, to just teach one piece of sexuality, stranger danger, is really not helping them. And it's also harming them because it's not teaching them to be alert and to identify those things that are the first cues that a relationship is unhealthy. So a comprehensive sexuality education is really critical. And what we teach from 22 lessons that really covers all those dimensions. It's trauma-informed, knowing that there is a high rate of abuse, and it's research-based. Next slide, please. We're coming into the home stretch of our presentation. We want to cover legal matters, which is, again, one of those top 7 reasons why people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are put under guardianship. Those are the concerns that others have that lead them to file that petition. So remember, all people have to deal with legal matters throughout their lives. It is even more important for youth with disabilities to learn about decision-making in legal matters like signing a lease or identifying that a person-centered plan becomes a legal document or a legal agreement between you and the provider agency, just as an IEP becomes a legal document between you and the school. There are many resources available to support families in explaining complex ideas. Contracts can and should be explained in plain language. So oftentimes it's just getting people to slow down and explain a legal document, a complex issue, in the person's primary language. And again, that primary language may be a language other than English. It may be through interpreters. It may be through pictures and gestures, but it's helping all involved in a conversation to understand how communication needs to happen for that particular individual, and that it needs to be person-centered in every situation. Next slide, please. If it's felt that the person needs a next level of support in understanding legal documents, a power of attorney is one thing that can be put into place. Again, it's a legally recognized document in Michigan. It can be put in place just for a specific time frame or a specific purpose, or it could be more extensive. It depends on what the individual needs and wants. It's different from guardianship in that this person only has a legal decision-making power just in those areas that the person has chosen, and it is somebody that they've chosen. So again, a power of attorney is a legal document that can be used to give another person the authority to make financial transactions, enter into contracts, make legal decisions, and sign legal documents on their behalf. Next slide, please. Jeanie, do you want to take us home with a wrap-up here?
Sure. The wrap-up: being a strong advocate. Being an individual in your own life is important. Communicate what you want and don't want. Be person-centered. Person-centered, using whatever tool works for the person. Every tool is different, so we use it for all people. Make sure that you communicate with the person which one they want. Being young, continue throughout life. Explore the supports that a person who need to continue to be in charge of their own life as they age, grow, and change into adulthood. To back into the all supported decision making is what all adults do in everyday life. Don't freeze people in time. Just because a person needs one level of support when they're 18, they will not continue to use the same support if they're 20 or whatever. The supports can change. Recognize what guardianship can and cannot do. Recognize the limits of guardianship. Next slide.
I think that last statement you made, Jeanie, is just so critical. There's this thought that guardianship creates this safety zone for an individual. And people under guardianship are no more safe than people without guardians. It's just critical to understand and recognize that last point that Jeanie just made. Recognize what a guardianship really can and can't do for a particular situation. So Jeanie, I know you've been involved as a civic or supported decision-making Center for Youth Voice, Youth Choice ambassador. And I'd like you to tell the audience a little bit about that. We'll go on to the next slide and we'll have you do it.
So the Youth Ambassador program really teaches several youth on what guardianship does and how to talk to other youth about what guardianship does. In the state of Michigan, we have looked for religions around the state, sexual diversity, type of disability, and gender identity. But the training was very comprehensive, but it also gave the youth a better understanding of what guardianship does and what supported decision making is. And it really helped me understand and be a better advocate for people with disabilities and to educate others. Next slide.
So we wanted to end the presentations with some additional resources. So if you have questions and concerns for yourself or for your loved one, in particular areas like the finances and Social Security, we've listed some websites here, things like the work incentive and ABLE accounts that we mentioned. The Michigan Bar Association also shares information about supported decision-making. And ARC-US has information as well. The graphic you see here shows where the ARCs in Michigan and their kind of catchment areas. And so there's either the state ARC or a local ARC that can help support you in understanding and finding any additional documents that you need regarding supported decision-making. Then on the next slide, we're going to share some additional resources and web pages that have a ton of information. We just recently posted to the Michigan Developmental Disabilities Council website the Supported Decision-Making Toolkit. As Jeanie can attest, there is a wealth of information there. Jeanie was one of the people with IDD who helped serve on the committee that put that resource together. And what we've done is divided it into age ranges, what you can be doing as a family from 0 to 5 years of age to help get and spur decision making, whether it's deciding what toothbrush color to purchase or what to have in a lunch. And then as a person grows and ages, adding additional more responsibilities to those decision making and helping them and supporting them to make more complicated decisions so that they can maximize their potential by the time they're ready to leave the school setting. And so there's lots of websites here. There's more information about joint banking, powers of attorney, special needs trust, and the WIPA program as well. Next slide, please. We wanted to pull you back to more information about the life course tools that we showed you earlier. It's www.lifecoursetools.com. Again, you can go to that website and get a wealth of tools that cover not just supported decision-making, but other life domains as well. Housing, employment, relationship building, and building and developing circles of support. There are a lot of resources and tools that you can find there as well. Next slide, please. Typically now is where we take questions from the audience. If you have questions that upon viewing this recording that you want to ask, we'll go to the next slide. Feel free to email either Jeanie or I. Our contact information appears on the screen here. You can contact us with information or questions that you may have. I frequently get calls from families and individuals who, we can walk through those life course tools in the toolkit and really help them to get started with that conversation so that we can really be person-centered for each individual. That wraps up our presentation for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeanie and Mary, for that fantastic information. I'm so glad you tuned in today and learned more with us. Remember, we are here for you as you have questions. Don't hesitate to reach out directly to your regional parent mentor for more information. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram. Check out the other videos in the video library on YouTube, and please feel free to explore the website. We hope this information was useful. We're so glad again that you tuned in. Michigan Alliance for Families is an IDEA grant-funded initiative of the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education, and Michigan's Federal Parent Training and Information Center, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs.